Welcome to Friday Philip with Libby Hall. This is episode 9, and today we're going to talk about faith and Matthew chapter 14.
Okay, I want to talk about faith this morning. So I'm going to share about a story that I'm sure you guys are very familiar with. It's in Matthew 14. And I actually was looking into the life of Peter this past week and just reading about him. And so I went through all the different, scriptures that talk about Peter and stopped on this one and thought, yeah, I'm going to share that this week. So I'm going to just share my thoughts on the story, give you a point about it, and then we'll talk about it. So what's happening in this story is that Jesus sent his disciples out in a boat while he went up into a mountain to be alone. And I want to stop before I go on and talk about Peter and make a point about this before we move on. So at this time, John the Baptist, who was Jesus's second cousin, he had been beheaded. He died. And Jesus had gotten news of that and was heartbroken, and he was grieving for his loss. But when he tried to be alone, the people were coming to him by the hundreds, right? They would just show up, and even the thousands. And his response to that was that he healed the people who came who needed healing. He taught them the word, and he fed at that time the 5,000. And then when he was done with that, he sent his people off in this boat into the water, and he went to this mountain to be alone. So Jesus was aware that he needed to care for himself, that he needed to have time to grieve. He was aware that he needed to go be with God and let God bring healing to his heart, because he was human and had that same process of grieving that we do. And so I just want to point that out. If he knew he needed that, we need to be aware that we need that too. That when we are grieving, when we are struggling, it is okay to need to go be alone. We take care of what we have to take care of. We don't, forget everything. We do what has to be done, and then we go take care of ourselves. Okay, so moving on. At 3 a.m., Jesus decides he's going to rejoin his team who are all in this boat, right? And it's very windy, and the boat is getting tossed around on the water. So Jesus walks out on the water to go meet his people, but it freaks them out. And so there's this whole boat full of grown men who start panicking and yelling, "It's a ghost." I always want to laugh when I think about that. Like, these grown men are like, "Oh, it's a ghost," like they're 5, right? But Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come." Peter had some amount of faith in the situation. He was afraid, but he had enough faith to believe that it was Jesus. And that Jesus would take care of them right in the middle of it. And so Jesus says to him, "Yeah, it's me. Come on out on the water." And Peter literally steps out of the boat onto the water. And we all know this story, but I think sometimes when we know a story, we gloss over things and we don't really focus in on what we need to take away from it. So he starts walking on top of the water, which is totally miraculous. It was miraculous enough that Jesus had done it. It was miraculous even more so that Peter had done it. And all of a sudden, this thought just came to my mind. It's not in my notes, but I want to share it. I had heard Michael Todd say about this story that really that miracle, I think it was Michael Todd who said it, could have been for everyone in the boat, because Jesus did not single out Peter, right? Peter's the one who asked Jesus. Everyone in that boat could have walked on water if they had had the faith to do it. But only Peter chose to respond to Jesus in that way. Oh, I have people waiting. Hang on. Admit. Okay, sorry. I'm going to do this during this today. I'm very sorry, but I don't have my assistant with me. Okay. So they could have all walked on the water, but only Peter did it. And so Peter is walking on the water, and all of a sudden he sees the wind, right? He had seen the wind. He knew the wind was there because it was tossing the boat around. But now suddenly it's very personal. Now suddenly he's on the water and the wind is hitting him, his physical body. And there is a fear that rises that, oh my God, I could drown right now. There's a new realization that happens because the attack or the offense becomes very personal. And so he allows fear to sneak in, and it causes him to start sinking again. He cries out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus reached out and grabbed his hand and rescued him. And then Jesus said something to Peter. And this is something that was always presented to me as though Jesus was rolling his eyes when he said it, right? Like Jesus was so tired of these fools who couldn't get it right. Jesus said, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And honestly, you could literally remove Peter's name in this story and replace it with mine, because I have been Peter many times in my life. Many times I have doubted in the middle of what God was doing. Even though I've seen him do amazing things, I've had doubt. And Jesus has had to look at me and say, "Oh, Libby, your faith is small. Why are you doubting me?" So I want to recap really quick. Jesus sent Peter out in a boat with his friends. Something scary happened. The crowd panicked. Peter had some panic, but he had enough faith to keep it together. So he thought, "No, I think this is Jesus. I think it's him. I'm going to step out in faith here." And he does. And he was right. It was Jesus. But then things got a little more rough. And because now the storm was not just around the boat, but it was also literally around Peter's body, he was in the middle of it, he began to let fear in, and in doing so, he lost his footing. He could not stand in the middle of the storm anymore. And so he began to doubt if Jesus was really able to sustain him in the situation. But in all of Peter's fear and doubt, he still knew who to call out for. And once again, he asked Jesus to save him. And once again, Jesus did. And Jesus said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" But the thing I want you to understand about this portion of scripture is that that question that he posed to Peter was not a dig at Peter. He wasn't rolling his eyes. He wasn't saying, "I am so tired of y'all right now." It was a constructive question that was necessary to get Peter to look at his situation and at his own heart. Peter needed to figure out why he didn't have the faith to do what Jesus had directed him to do. Why? Because he was going to be asked to do even bigger things. And there had to be growth and development in his faith before he was asked to do bigger things, because he would have never been able to do them, right? If he can't accomplish the small things in faith, how can he accomplish the larger things? It's a building process. And so Jesus pointed out Peter's lack of faith and then asked him to reflect on why he had a lack of faith. It's something that, it's funny to me. I look back and I can see the face of the people who taught this to me with rolling eyes, like, "Oh, this Jesus was going, that's ridiculous. Why don't you have faith?" And all of a sudden, in a moment, in my own prayer time, in my own Bible reading, God said to me, "Why would I ever respond to you that way?" And I'm like, "I don't know, because I'm stupid a lot of the time." And God's like, "Well, yeah, sometimes you are, but I would not respond to you that way." He doesn't. And Jesus was going to ask Peter another hard question. "Do you love me?" And he was going to give him another hard directive. "Feed my sheep." And the truth is that Peter was going to fail by denying Jesus. And Jesus knew that. And this time, Peter was going to have to walk that process out without Jesus physically standing with him. And so Jesus, in that moment on the water, had to get Peter to look at why his faith was not big enough to walk on the water, because Peter was going to preach. Peter was literally going to lay his life down for the cause of Christ, and he was going to die. And Jesus knew that he would never be able to do that if his faith was still struggling at the walking on the water part. And we look at walking on water, right? And we think that's this massive miracle. As people, we look at that and go, oh my gosh, that's mind-blowing. How did he do that? No, the massive miracle is to be able to stand in the midst of adversity, in the midst of the storm, and preach the gospel and die for what you believe. That's the miracle, right? And that is where Jesus had to get Peter's faith. His faith was tested and stretched all along the way throughout his time with Jesus so that he could be prepared for what God had called him to. And so when you feel like you failed, when you feel like you've tried to answer the call and do the thing, you've tried to step out in faith, you've tried to accomplish what God's called you, and you've fallen, know that that wasn't failure. It was training. It was a time of training where God could turn back to you and say, okay, now why did that not work? Why was that so hard? Let's look at where you need to shore up in your faith. Let's look at your life and see what do you need to do to grow your faith so that the next thing I ask you to do, you can do it, right? Because if you can't walk on the water, you can't lay down your life. It's not going to happen. And so he asks us the question not to make us feel bad, but so that we can learn from it and grow from it, grow in our faith and overcome. The question that Jesus asked Peter was loving and kind. He posed it to him because he knew what Peter was going to be called to do. And he knew Peter wasn't ready, but he was helping him grow. I've had massive failures in my life. I have had huge missteps and little missteps. I've mishandled things that God gave me, what God had me doing. But the one thing I can say is that I've never turned away from God, right? In the middle of those failures, when I was down on my face, every time I've called out to him and said, oh my gosh, what the heck did I do? I made a mess. My God, will you save me? And every single time he has. Every single time he has reached his hand down, grabbed it, and pulled me back out. He's never, ever left me. Because his goal is my success, right? And for him to walk away from me in the middle of a failure is for him to abandon his goal. His goal is for me to succeed. His aim is for me to actually do the thing that he's called me to do the thing that he has planned for me to do. And if he leaves me in the middle of my failure, I can't do that. But if he says, okay, let's look at why this didn't work. And let's get you to the place where you're on your feet again and now can step up to the next thing I've called you to. He will keep giving me opportunity to learn from my mistakes and to grow as a woman of God and as a woman of great faith, a woman that he can use. And so the key point I want you to understand today is that failure is not final. In fact, failure is faith training. Failure is not final. Failure is faith training. That's where we learn.
Thanks for listening to Friday Fill Up with Libby Hall. This was episode 9 on Matthew 14. Join us next Friday for episode 10, where we will talk about James 1:19. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next week.